Welcome to episode 87 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew Sykes. Now, in this episode of the podcast, we're going to be listening to two people. Later, we're going to hear from Steve Cuthbertson, who is going to be telling us all about his cycle back from Romania to the UK. But first, we're going to hear from Joel Stokoe. He is British, he comes from Yorkshire, but he has been living on Cyprus for just over 10 years, and he's been a keen cyclist all that time. But recently, he decided to set off on a multi-day trip around the island to explore all the nooks and crannies. So a couple of weeks ago, I sat down with him, and as I always do, I asked him to start by introducing himself.
Hi there, I'm Joel and I live and cycle around the wonderful island of Cyprus.
Right, and you contacted me a few weeks ago. You sent me an email because you were telling me about your experiences of cycling, not just in Cyprus, but elsewhere, back here in Britain as well. So we're going to talk about that, hopefully mainly about Cyprus, because it's not a country I've ever visited, and I think there's probably a lot to learn about cycling on Cyprus. But before we get there, can you just kind of explain how somebody from Rotherham ends up working and living in Cyprus?
So I'm a teacher, so I worked for several years in various schools in the UK. However, I secured a job working in Cyprus with the MOD about 11 years ago. And since then, we've been living in Cyprus.
And you live on a military base, is that right? Somewhere near Larnaca?
Yeah, so we're just on the outskirts of Larnaca. Can almost see the sea from my bedroom window, which is an absolute treat to wake up to each day.
People know Cyprus, they know it as a holiday destination, they know that it has lots of British connections, hence the reason why you're actually living and working there. They also probably know that it's a divided island. Could you just talk through briefly the modern history of Cyprus in terms of how it is split and how it is managed?
So Cyprus is split into not two halves, two sections, if you like. So there's the northern section, which is controlled by the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. And then there's the Republic of Cyprus, which is where we live. I think the split is about 2/3 to 1/3. And we live and spend the majority of our time in the Republic.
Okay. And the northern part, which is the smaller part, that is Turkish ruled and mainly Turkish speakers, whereas the southern part, which is the bigger part, is mainly Greek speaking. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. And that's since the 1974 conflict.
You've kind of hinted there that you can go into northern Cyprus. Do you often go into the northern part?
Yeah, so we've holidayed in northern Cyprus. I've cycled there a few times. People are the same throughout, the lovely people wherever you are on the island. Uh, Absolutely.
And is that the same for people who are Cypriot nationals if they live in the southern part, in your part of the island? Can they travel freely to the north?
Yeah, absolutely. Some people obviously might choose not to, but you see an awful lot of crossover of cultures and people. A lot of conflicts, obviously, they all boil down to politics at the end of it. People are generally quite happy chatting to each other. But you can still see some of the scars of the conflicts as well of the past.
And there's still, I'm looking at the map now, there's still this kind of buffer zone, no man's land, between the two halves of the island. Is that a populated area, or is that completely void of anything?
So it's sort of known as the Green Line, and it's patrolled. So you've got the UN sort of patrol that, and some parts are fields, but no, generally it's pretty much unpopulated to my knowledge.
But it sounds as though relations on an individual level, from person to person, between people who know each other in the two halves, they're pretty cordial. We're not talking North Korea, South Korea, or East and West Germany as it used to be. It's a very different situation by the sounds of it.
I think it is overall. I think, and especially, for ourselves as you're walking around and chatting with different people, people on the whole are good. And you meet loads of lovely people and work with lovely people who've lived on either side. That makes no difference to us, really.
Yeah. Okay, right. Well, moving on to the cycling bit. Prior to moving to Cyprus 11 years ago, had you done much cycling?
Yeah, so over the years, I've done various cycling, whether from being a kid through my teens. And I mean, I think it was about 7 or 8 years ago with my dad and my brother-in-laws. We did the coast to coast. We did Morecambe Bay to Sunderland across right to is it Whitehaven? So we did that a few years ago. Um, and I've always used bikes. I think great to get around. I've enjoyed cycling, and I started doing a little bit more cycling uh, as the kids got a little bit older. I had a little bit more time, and I jumped back on the bike again.
Right. And how many bikes have you got?
I've only got three at the moment.
Only three. That's a pretty good number. And have you got a touring bike? Have you got a racing bike? What kind of bikes are there?
So I've got a bike that was it's a road bike, but I've managed to put bigger tires on it, so I can use that off road if I'm riding anywhere with the kids. And then I've got two road bikes. One's an older one, and the one that I use sort of day to day whenever I'm cycling.
And is there a cycling culture in Cyprus? Do you see lots of people cycling, or is it something that I mean, it's pretty mountainous. I'm looking at the map. Most of your bit of Cyprus is basically mountains. Does that have an impact on how people approach cycling?
I think there's a small culture of cycling in Cyprus. It's not sort of embedded like it might be on the continent, but you do see groups of cyclists around. That's not unusual, and you're absolutely right. As you're in the middle of the map, it's all the Troodos range. So your coastal areas are obviously generally flatter, and then once you're out of there, you're into the hills.
Mm. Some of the other Mediterranean islands, like Mallorca and Malta, perhaps, certainly the Spanish ones, they're very popular with professional cycling teams during the winter. They tend to head to these places because it's a bit warmer,
Mhm.
but it offers quite challenging cycling. Do you ever see, or are you aware of any of the teams heading to Cyprus to do their training?
You do. I think you get a small influx over the winter season of small groups doing training or maybe holiday rides. But it's not massive like some of the other places. It's not got that. It's not renowned for the winter season just yet. But it could be. It's a great place to cycle. It offers everything: accommodation, food. Some brilliant roads. So it's possibly the missing a trick.
Yeah, well, it's good to know that you got food on Cyprus. Right, okay. So you decided to do a tour of your bit of Cyprus. So can you, first of all, just kind of give us the background to why did you decide to do this, and when did you do it? How long did it take, and things like that?
So I suppose we've been, often you talk about these ideas, and I'm a great one for looking through books at pretty pictures of lovely places to visit. And it just so came about that I had a few days that I could use. And I don't know about typically, but I'd sort of started looking about going to other places before I sort of slapped myself and thought, you've got you've got a beautiful place here. Why not use what you've got on your doorstep? Um, and so, that's where the sort of idea came from. As it was, it turned out I had 8 days to myself where I was able to go off and not worry about having to come home. So I could book accommodation and make a sort of a loop to get around the island and see some new places and spend a little bit more time looking at the places that I was cycling through as well, because quite typically I can go out for a ride. I'm restricted to time, so I zip off and maybe don't appreciate everything that's around. So I did a lot more stopping off, taking photographs, and sort of looking around places, learning a little bit about the places along the way.
And when did you do this?
So it was in March this year, so about 8 months ago. So it was on the run up to Easter.
Okay, what's the weather like in March?
So the weather was a very mild winter. It was very nice. I wore long sleeves some days, but I could easily wear short sleeves as well. It was sort of in betweeny, depending where I was on the time of day. The only thing I sort of made an error with myself was not checking out for the sort of Coptic storms that Cyprus gets each year. A Coptic storm is a weather system that comes across and can be very rainy, but it's certainly very windy for a few days. And there's several times throughout the year when we get these weathers. And unfortunately, I did land a pretty windy day in the middle, but that was my own poor planning.
Yeah, you mentioned these Coptic storms in the article that you wrote, and I read it earlier. Now, can you explain exactly what they are? Because I think in your article you said Google it, so I did. I Googled it, and I've come up with a list here, and there are, I don't know, there's probably about 10, 15 different named storms, but they've got a precise date, the 11th of January, the 19th of January, the 28th of January, and they've got a translated name into English, and they've got a duration, 3 days, 5 days,
Mhm.
2 days. Now, clearly, the weather is the weather. You can't predict the weather that accurately. So is this just old wives' tales?
I think it's a bit of old wives' tale, but it seems to still fit true at times as well. So we do get these sort of seasonal maybe storms that come through, and they tend to be within uh, a time period, a time frame. So it might be that late January, for example, you have a couple of days, you'd expect a storm around then. I'm not sure on the accuracy of all of them, and there's various sites that you can find. But absolutely, yeah, we get these storms and they come through and they're pretty intense, brilliant to watch. Lots of thunder, lots of lightning, lots of rain, very intense winds as well at times. But yeah, there's definitely something in there. I wish I'd checked out the calendar a bit more carefully before I set off, to be honest. But that's life.
So what date did you set off?
Must have been about the 20 something of March, 22nd, maybe 23rd.
Right, according to this list that I've got, it says 20th of March, El Shams or El Kabira. It's a wind from the east. It translates as big sun gale, and it's supposed to last for 2 days. Did you experience it?
So yeah, it must have been a couple of days late, maybe. Basically, on the day that I was heading, I was going across the back of Troodos towards a coastal town called Polis. It was extremely windy, and that night in the room, I was watching the sea sort of whip up, and the weather reports weren't looking great. But again, the next morning, I got up, and it was a bit blustery, and I was a tad cautious as you might be when you're heading out. But it all worked out fine in the end. It was okay. I think there's sometimes you get these gusts of wind that can be quite intense, a bit like the UK is experiencing now, I believe. Uh, but all worked out.
Now, the route that you took, imagine that anybody listening to this, and this is probably advice to the listeners, imagine they're looking at a map of Cyprus, like I'm doing now. Could you just quickly describe the route that you took? Obviously, you presumably started in Larnaca, and well, can you take it from there? Just name a few of the places that you actually visited along the way.
So yeah, so I started in Larnaca, and I sort of took it would be a northwesterly direction towards the north coast, which took me past the sort of outskirts of Nicosia, and then I sort of came up into the Troodos range, and I went up to a lot of the villages that I went to were quite small. I didn't go to major places. I went up to a little village called Padulas, and then I took on a westerly sort of route past a big monastery known as Kikos Monastery, and went across to Polis, which is a coastal resort on the northwest coast. I then came back round sort of in a loopy fashion in the hills above Paphos before I eventually went up to the top of Mount Olympus, which is the high point in Cyprus, before making my way back down. So it was a sort of big loop, but it was more central to Cyprus. I didn't go through the sort of the Paphos and the Limassol, the big coastal towns. I sort of stayed away from those a little bit more.
And you then returned down to Larnaca on the coast, presumably?
Absolutely, yeah. So I hit the coast again, and back into Larnaca for home.
And were you following a set route? Were you following bike paths, or was it mainly on road?
No, it was all on road. I'd sort of planned out a route with a friend, and I had booked accommodation on the way. I don't know, pretty typically for myself, maybe I'd overestimated what could be done, so I sort of adjusted the route along the way based on where my next accommodation was. So initially, it would have taken in much more climbing and distance, but actually, it turned out, I felt I didn't feel the need to do quite as much. I wanted to ensure that I enjoyed where I went. I spent time, as I said before, actually exploring these places, photographing them, enjoying them.
And in terms of distances, I'm just trying to guesstimate what the size of Cyprus is. I'm looking at the scale here on this map, and I'm guessing it's probably about 150 kilometres from west to east. Is that right?
I have no idea, to be absolutely honest. If you were to follow the coast all the way around in sort of both parts, I think it's about 600k.
And your trip that you've just described, how many kilometres was it in the end?
So it was around 800 kilometres. There were a couple of days that were sort of over 100 and a couple of days in the middle that were shorter, but it turned out at around 800 kilometres.
Right, I'm amazed because I'm thinking 800 kilometres actually on a relatively small island. That's pretty significant. You clearly weren't going from point to point. You were clearly taking all the nooks and crannies to seek out the things that you know you wanted to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a case of maybe, go right out this way. It was all loops. They weren't, like you say, it wasn't sort of out and back. The majority was loops. Maybe go across one direction, then come back round on the south side of the hill, so to speak, and then go up to the top of Mount Olympus, and then spent a little bit of time, like I say, on those the southern slopes of Troodos before heading back towards the eastern slopes and across that way.
And what were cycling conditions like in terms of the traffic on the road and the surfaces? Are they generally pretty good quality roads to cycle on?
Yeah, they're fantastic. I mean, I ride a road bike, as I say, and the surfaces. Some of the roads maybe need a little bit of work, but on the whole, they're absolutely fine. And traffic, again, that's why I tend to keep inland a little bit more. It's usually a little bit quieter, which I enjoy. And that's why I kept away from those bigger touristy areas, if you like I say, Paphos and such. But the roads tend to be fairly quiet. You see the odd cyclist, but on the whole, they're fairly quiet, and they're all tarmacked and so on. So, yeah, the conditions are fantastic. The weather's fantastic at that time of year. There's loads of sort of positives to it.
Were you travelling pretty light? It sounds as though you weren't camping. You were staying in B&Bs, hostels, things like that. So were you travelling fairly light?
Yeah, I stayed at, I used booking.com to book various accommodation, whether it was a hotel, B&B, whatever. So yeah, I just had a couple of bags on the bike with some spare clothes and the usual sort of kit that I might take out, the wet stuff, plus some tools, and make sure I had enough food on me because obviously quite some of these places are quite remote. I didn't want to be running out of food at any point, and the usual couple of bottles. So yeah, it was fairly light. I wasn't bothered about camping as such.
If anybody did want to go to Cyprus and camp, uh, what would their experience be like? Would they find any campsites?
There are some campsites. I've not used them. And I don't really know many people who sort of go off wild camping, to be quite honest with you. I think there's some fantastic spots that you could go off and stay in. I think there's some beautiful areas. But in terms of facilities, I'm not sure that you're always going to find as many facilities as you might expect or as you might find elsewhere in the world. I mean, one of the real positives is there's often water taps in the villages, in the hills especially. So you can always fill your bottles up quite easily, and there tends to be coffee shops in most of the villages, so you can stop and sort of soak in the moment as well as a coffee before you sort of move on. But some of the stretches, you might have 10 or 15k, 20k where there's nothing for a time. So especially in the summer, it's good to be able to fill up your bottles when you've got those opportunities.
And you said that you cycled about 800 kilometres in terms of distance. I'm just looking on the CIA fact book, and it tells me that the highest point, you mentioned it already, Mount Olympus, 1,951 metres, which is, a decent height for such a small island. And bearing in mind, that's real 1,951 metres, because basically lots of people will travel from sea level up to 1,951 meters. It's not like going to certain mountains, for example, in the Alps, where you are already at a very high level when you start either cycling or walking to the top of the mountain. So, do you know how many meters of climbing you did?
Yeah, so when I finished, I sort of went on and did a full map of it all. And it turned out I did about, I think it was just under 16,000 meters of climbing. So obviously, as you say, I started at sea level, finished at sea level. And throughout that, obviously, that was the average would be the 2,000 a day. But I think the most I did was about 2,800 one day. And obviously, there were days when I maybe just ticked over 1,000.
That's a decent amount.
Yeah, it's good. To me, they're the best roads. You can get in, you get into your rhythm. There's some stunning places to see, and you can just sort of wendle your way across or up, or however, enjoy the views. You get some amazing views to sort of see, especially when you get to the top of some of these spots. You can just really appreciate the moment. So yeah, that they're the best roads in my opinion. They're the ones I enjoy doing the most. Hence the route, if you like.
Are you a very fit person?
Just average, I'd have said. I can do that. I did that for those few days, but then my initial plan was much bigger, and I think it was a bit of a crash to earth when I realised after day one, when I'd done nearly 100 mile, and I think sort of 2.5, nearly 3,000 meters climb, and I thought I probably can't sustain this for the next week, so I reined it in a bit. But yeah, I think I'm decent fitness. But at the same time, you just crack on with it. You just keep pedaling. If you're enjoying it, it doesn't matter.
Back to Joel in a few minutes. Now, Steve Cuthbertson, I've got to first of all make an apology to Steve. He contacted me earlier in the year, and he recorded the monologue that you're about to hear way back in August, but it's taken all this time for me to actually get round to putting it in the podcast. So apologies, Steve, for the delay. However, it is worth listening to. We're going to hear it in two parts. First of all, in a few moments, you're just going to hear some background information about Steve and the lead up to his journey from Romania back to the UK. And then once we've heard the second part of the interview with Joel, we'll go back to Steve and listen to how he actually got on cycling from Romania back to the UK. But first, here's Steve setting the scene, explaining who he is and why he decided to cycle from Romania back to the UK in the first place.
Hello, I'm Stephen Cuthbertson. First, a little about myself. I've been cycling for as long as I can remember, but first started cycling seriously when I was a teenager. I rode with a couple of local clubs and took part in time trials and Audax rides, and even the occasional road race. As time passed, I learnt to drive and the cycling fell by the wayside. Fast forward about 25 years, and with an ever-increasing middle-age spread, I thought it was time to do something about it. So I bought myself a mountain bike from a friend and started riding. It wasn't long before I remembered that I do actually like cycling. I started riding to work and back, which was about a 40-mile round trip at the time, riding in all weathers, rain, shine, ice and snow. I did sometimes wonder about the wisdom of doing this on one occasion where I found myself sliding down the road on my backside on sheet ice. I rode my first multi-day ride in 2014, where I concocted a series of challenges in order to raise money for Cancer Research UK, as my father had been diagnosed with esophageal cancer. First on the list was cycling to the start of the Tour de France, which in 2014 was in Leeds. As I'd ridden to the start, I thought it only right that I should ride to the finish too, in Paris, so I did. As a grand finale, I rode from Land's End to John O'Groats. Fast forward again to 2023, and while I had continued to ride my bike, I hadn't undertaken anything earth-shattering. But in the interim, I had adopted a Romanian shepherd dog, a huge bundle of fluff called Stella. Stella had been rescued by a local charity called Amici, with kennels in Worcestershire, Immingham and Humberside, and a small village called Vișoara in Romania. Stella was abandoned at the edge of a forest, but had the fortune to be found by a veterinary student, who took her home and nursed her back to health. Amici stepped in to help rehome Stella, and after a shaky start, she ended up with me. Now, Amici, like many other rescues, often struggle to raise funds for their cause, so in an effort to give something back, I decided to undertake a sponsored bike ride from the kennels in Worcestershire to the kennels in Immingham, a distance of 160 miles. I planned to do this in one day, so I packed in a few long-distance Audax rides as training. Then I found myself standing outside the kennels at 5 a.m. one June morning. I was pretty confident that I could make the distance, but I had no idea how long it might take me. After a pista camera, I believe it's called, I set off, serenaded by the sound of barking dogs. The weather soon warmed up, and I made good progress, despite the northeasterly headwind that stayed with me through the day. I plotted a route that avoided main roads where possible, following lanes and cycle paths and even a section of the Eurovelo 12. With one eye on my Garmin and another on my Just Giving page, I stopped for lunch in Radcliffe-on-Trent, where I'd noticed that we'd just surpassed the £500 mark. During another piece to camera, with tongue-in-cheek, I said, if we get to £1,000, I'll ride back tomorrow. I hadn't actually considered how I was going to get back, but highest on the list was probably by train. Cycling back wasn't on the list at all. I finally rolled up at the gates of the Immingham Kennels at 7:30 p.m. after 14 hours in the saddle. We'd raised £761 for Amici, and I think I breathed a sigh of relief. I stayed the night with a relative nearby and awoke about 6 a.m. The first thing I did was look at my Just Giving page and, oh dear, £1,021. Not wanting to go back on my commitment, I hurriedly got dressed, ate breakfast and head back to the kennels. I left at about 7:30, and although I was still aching from the previous day's efforts, yesterday's headwind was today's tailwind, so initial progress was pretty good. Later in the day, it got fairly hot, with temperatures in the high 20s, and I started to feel it. I probably didn't eat or drink enough. I definitely felt I'd bitten off more than I could chew. I pushed through, though, and finally arrived back at the Worcester Kennels at about 8 p.m. The final total was 320 miles in 2 days and £1,505 raised. Summing up afterwards, I made another disposable comment. Now, how far is it from Vișoara to Worcester? Well, it turns out that it's about 1,700 miles. So I mulled that figure around in my head for a while. If I could get 3 weeks off work, and if I could ride 100 miles a day, that would give me a few days contingency, which would also need to encompass getting to Vișoara in the first place. I presented my plans to Anne,
at Amici. "You're mad," she said. Putting that to one side, she arranged for the dog rescue van, colloquially named as the Happy Bus, to transport my touring bike, which incidentally is a Ridgeback World Panorama with no name, to Vishwara, leaving me with only a collection of panniers to take with me at a later date. I flew from Birmingham to Cluj-Napoca on a Saturday afternoon, arriving at something like 2 a.m. local time, crashed in an Airbnb, and then took the train from Cluj to Campia Turzi the following morning. The team from Amici, Romania collected me from the station. We collected my bike from Dora's mum's house. Dora is the lady that runs the rescue in Romania. Then we went to the kennels in Vishwara, where I was met by Dora, Daniela, Joanna and Michaela. After a brief lunch of sandwiches and cake that had been liberated from a wedding the previous evening, and a tour of the kennels, 300 dogs, a cat and a donkey, I set off on my ride at about 3 p.m.
Back to Steve in a few minutes. However, before we do that, let's hear the second part of the interview with Joel, who is telling us all about his travels around the island of Cyprus. Talk about some of the places that you visited en route, some of the highlights in terms of the towns, the villages, the various sites that you passed through and took time to explore.
Yeah, so I mean, I sort of hit various across the way. I mean, there's some of the mining villages. There's one called Mitsiro, which is on the outskirts of Nicosia. It's not a mining village anymore, but it was once. And above that, there were the old structures. There were the sort of machinery and structures that you could see rust in there, which is always sort of a nod to the past. I mean, there's a lot of religious history in Cyprus. I visited one of the sort of painted churches. It's one of the UNESCO sites. So that was interesting to see and sort of tucked away in the middle of nowhere, really. So it was really nice to find it, really cool to see it. And it was a really nice little road to cycle up and down to see, because that was just, as I say, out of the way. Touched upon the Kikos Monastery and the monument to the first president, which was an amazing place to see. Went across Cedar Valley, which was just sort of stunning to ride through. And I found a real variation in not just the landscape, but the places. I mean, some of the villages I passed through were abandoned villages for various reasons. So you sort of see what's left behind. Then there's swathes of land that are given over to maybe vineyards or citrus fruits. You've got a real variation in the landscape and what you can see. Even only over a few short days, it's pretty amazing how much you can see and maybe how much you don't appreciate what's on your own doorstep, to speak.
On my map here, it refers to the Paphos forest.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a forest like we would expect, or is it quite different?
Yeah, absolutely. It's predominantly pine. A lot of the trees in the hills are pine, but absolutely. And as you come out of the forest towards Polis, you get, I got a real feeling of, maybe it was the timing and everything else, but sort of it became much lighter as you got out of the trees. It was much brighter and much warmer, and that brought me out over towards that western coast, or that northwest coastline.
Do the trees give you much shade?
They can do, yeah, yeah. So it can be in areas as you're going through the middle bit. It can feel quite overwhelming because you're lots of tall pine trees, especially when you drop down into the valleys. So they can give you plenty of shade in the summer, but equally, the moment you leave them and when the sun's high, it can be a little bit of your sun trap as well.
And Mount Olympus,
Mm-hmm.
there's Mount Olympus on Greece, obviously. This one is not in Greece. This one's on Cyprus. Can you actually get to the summit with your bike, or does the road finish somewhere quite a distance from the summit itself?
No, you're pretty much at the top. There's actually a military installation at the top. So you ride up to the top where there's a roundabout and there's gates into military installations. That's the summit as far as I was concerned. And you can stop and soak in the view for a moment before heading back down towards Troodos Square, where you've got your cafes and you sort of your facilities.
Now, back in 2013, I cycled the Eurovelo 8 or rather my version of the Eurovelo 8, because at the time, and I think this is still true to a certain extent, it didn't really exist in terms of signposts or marked cycle routes that you could follow. So I just kind of made it up as I went along. But I did start in Athens, or rather, I flew to Athens, took the bike down to Cape Sunio, where there's the Temple of Poseidon, because I reckon that was the most southeasterly point of the entire route. And then 2 months later, I arrived at Cape St. Vincent, which is in the southwestern corner of Portugal. At the time, back in 2013, and I'm glad it didn't, Eurovelo 8 did start in Athens, but since then, the European Cyclist Federation have extended it, and it now starts on a loop in Cyprus. And if you go to the Eurovelo website and you go to Cyprus, you'll see that it has a dotted loop all the way around, and then presumably you're encouraged to get a ferry, I would imagine, from Cyprus up to somewhere near Athens to continue the bit where I started. Now, to what extent did you see any infrastructure which was labelled Eurovelo 8 on your particular journey, or to what extent are you aware of the fact that it is in fact part of Eurovelo 8? Is it something that you've read about, you've heard about, you've talked about?
So I've seen the maps of the Eurovelo routes, and yeah, I have seen that one before with the loop on Cyprus, but I've never actually followed it. So in terms of my ride, I would say I possibly took in part of the northern part and over towards the northwest, would take in part of the loop that you can see on the map, but I saw absolutely no signposts or anything else for it. And I've never seen any or been aware of any on the island. Looking at the map, it takes you through sort of Paphos and Limassol, right along the coast, and there are some wonderful spots along there. But as I sort of said before, I tend to keep away from those touristy areas a little bit more because they've got your towns. They tend to be that little bit busier, although they might have more accommodation and restaurants and so on. I'd sort of rather be inland a little bit more, where it's a little bit more peaceful. But I've never seen any of the signposts or anything linked to it, to be quite honest, apart from on the Eurovelo website, as you say.
Mm. I mean, it would make a decent cycle tour in itself. I mean, that you said you did 800 kilometres. I would imagine that's probably more than 800 kilometres. Looking at the way it's been mapped out to go around most of what is now the southern part of Cyprus.
There's also loads of opportunities for cycling in the north. I've not done an awful lot of it myself. It's sort of time restricted as sort of usual. But, I have done some bike rides, and that's sort of equally as lovely to ride around in. You've got the Kyrenia mountain range over in the north, or on that north coast. And then I think it's quite isolated as you go right towards the east. I can't remember the name of the peninsula, but it can be quite quiet down there. But you get plenty of people cycling over that side of the island as well. And from what I know, it's equally as good. It's not something I've experienced as much as, I say, the odd day ride where we've nipped over. But you have to go through a border crossing, which can be a bit slow, and so it often limits time. Or it's sort of, maybe if you haven't got as much time, you're not going to sort of take that chance.
Have you ever considered going to some of the neighbouring countries to do any cycling?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. I've got a great big bucket list of ideas. uh, so I've looked at Crete because Crete is quite close. I'd quite like to get over there and spend a week zipping around. I think that could be great fun. But then equally, we often visit Europe or the UK with family and such. I'd really enjoy cycling the Western Front Way through France. I don't know if you're aware of that route.
I think I've heard of it. I can imagine where it goes, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So that's another one I'd really like to do. I think it'd be really interesting. I always like to sort of learn about what's along the way as well. So I think obviously there's a lot of history in there. I have thought before about maybe trying to cycle home or say home, sort of back to Doncaster, where I hail from Cyprus. But again, it's a big time commitment when you've got a young family. So maybe leave it until the children are a little bit older. But I think you could make a great route out of that, up through Greece, Albania, Croatia, and so on. I think you could have a great time. And a lot of the Euro routes, the Velo routes, they crisscross along the way. You could use those to help guide you home as well.
Is your wife a cyclist?
No, she is not. No. No, she's quite happy for me to go off and do things, but she's not bothered now.
Well, perhaps you could, if one day you decided to come back to Britain to live, you could stick all your possessions in the back of a van, and then she could drive the van with the kids, and you could just kind of take your time on the bike, and they could find accommodation every evening and cook for you, and then slowly plod your way across Europe that way.
I think that's a wonderful idea. I'll have to mention that to her as soon as she gets home. Yeah, I think that something like that would be fantastic to sort of have the freedom and time to wendle our way across Europe. And it's something that I would quite happily do, although obviously maybe get the kids on the bike a bit more as well.
Is it a relatively easy place to get to over land, Cyprus? I mean, presumably most tourists who go there fly there.
There is a ferry service, or there has been in the last couple of years, that takes you to Athens. So that's Limassol to Athens, I believe. I think the only other way you could do it, and I've not looked into it, would be through the north, where you get a ferry over to Turkey.
Right. Obviously, you're quite close to places that are currently, sadly, in the news: Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan. People do go cycling in Jordan. Would that ever be a possibility?
We'd love to visit lots of places. Unfortunately, we've not managed to get to those, and at the moment they don't seem as though they're safe places to visit. But absolutely, anywhere's a possibility, isn't it? The great thing about a bike is you pick it up and you can, you've got your own transport and you can carry enough of your own things to just go off. The world's a small place. Well, we've got internet, we've got phones. Most things can be sort of covered in terms of finding accommodation and maps and everything else. It's I think it's quite easy for us to do nowadays.
It does actually look as though you can get a ferry from southern Cyprus, from Limassol, down to Israel by the looks of it.
I'm not aware of that. Maybe it might even just be a cargo ship. I don't know. I've not heard of that one.
So any future plans, any future concrete plans? You've talked about things that you'd like to do, but any definite plans as to things that you're definitely going to do?
No, I think I'm just going to. So I spent a lot of time when I was on my sort of tour learning about places. I think I'm trying to put these rides into sort of routes that people could possibly do in a day, sort of day routes, loops, if you like. And I'm still learning about, the place that I live in now. As I said earlier, it's very easy to flit off somewhere different and visit there, but actually there's loads that I've still not discovered in Cyprus yet. I'd quite happily do another sort of multi-day tour over here for now. And then I don't know, we'll have to see what 2025 brings. There's no concrete plans yet.
I'm on the Visit Cyprus website, and they've got 7 pages of cycling routes, lots and lots of different options there. So there are clearly lots of things you could do in your own backyard. So just to finish with, if you were to give 3 reasons why people should come over to Cyprus to do some cycling, do some cycle touring, what would those 3 reasons, those 3 things be?
I would say, firstly, the people of Cyprus are lovely, lovely people. Very friendly, very helpful. As I say, a lovely culture. Secondly, the climate is fantastic. Even the storms, when you get them, are great fun because they're so sort of dramatic. And thirdly, it's a beautiful sort of place with loads and loads to see, but absolutely full of history as well. So it sort of ticks lots of boxes in my view. You might be able to see something if you're into history that is of value to you. But equally, if your passion is nature and animals, then you're equally likely to see something that you find fascinating. I think it's got a real breadth for everybody in that respect.
Well, I think you've done a pretty good job there in doing the work of the Cyprus Tourist Board. I think you've painted a really positive picture there of cycling in Cyprus, and yeah, it's yet another place that I shall add to my ever-increasing list of places that I should visit. Perhaps one day I will, but we'll see. So if people want to get in contact with you, do you have any online social media presence or a website or anything like that?
I have an Instagram page at the moment, which I'm afraid I can't remember the name of.
I shall remind you, because I've written it down.
Thank you kindly.
You've made yourself a very complicated Instagram handle, I have to say. But it is Joel, Joel, _ wandering _ and _ pondering. Does that ring a bell?
Absolutely, yeah. Wandering and pondering around. I think that's a good way to live life.
Well, on that note, I think that's a perfect time to finish. So thank you for that, and have a good cycling 2025 on the island of Cyprus.
Oh, thank you for your time. It's lovely to chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Joel for telling us all about his travels around Cyprus. Now, since we recorded that, Joel has done two things. He's first of all set up his own website, and you can visit that at cyclingcyprus.org, and you can see and read about his travels around the island. He's also, quite wisely, changed his Instagram handle, and it is no longer the one that we talked about in the interview. He's changed it to simply at Joel is cycling, which is a lot easier to remember. So go and visit those two places, and you can find out more about his travels on two wheels in Cyprus. You'll also be able to read about that multi-day trip around the island in an upcoming edition of Cycle magazine, Cycling UK's magazine, and that should be published sometime early in 2025, I think. Right, so thank you to Joel for that. We're back to Romania now, back to Steve Cuthbertson. He's just arrived in Romania, and he's about to set off on his journey back to the UK. So over to you, Steve, to complete your story.
I had spent quite a lot of time online plotting my route and planned on picking up the Eurovelo 6 somewhere in Hungary, then riding that all the way to Germany. I then planned to cut across to the Eurovelo 15 and ride down the Rhine all the way to the Hook of Holland. Ferry to Harwich and then Harwich to Worcester. That still left about 600 kilometres across Romania and Hungary unplanned, but I noticed that on OpenStreetMap there was a cycle route that followed the river Mureș all the way from Aiud to Arad, which would cover almost the first 300 miles, so I planned on following this. I'd broken my 1,700-mile trip down into 100-mile chunks, and I was going to try and ride one chunk a day. That didn't work out exactly as planned, as obviously starting at 3 p.m, there was no way I was going to ride 100 miles on the first day. I did manage to get to Aiud though, about 30 miles. The road was fantastic. You could kind of liken it to your experience of the N630 in Spain, Andrew, because the A10 motorway has been built alongside the E81 and all the traffic is on the motorway, leaving the old road almost empty. I spent the night in a hotel in Aiud, but there was no breakfast, or rather there was breakfast, but not until 8 a.m, and I wanted to be long gone by then. I found the hotels in Romania to be very reasonably priced, and although I did take a tent, it just didn't seem worthwhile using it at this point. The food was also reasonable, although most of my diet consists of an Audax-style raid on petrol stations, so choice was sometimes a bit limited. The following day, I rode from Aiud to Lipova, which was my longest day, or 144 miles. Again, the roads were pretty good, although the cycle route did lead me through something more akin to a forestry track than a road at one point. I was a bit disappointed when I arrived at Lipova because I couldn't find any open restaurants, so I did another petrol station raid and ate in my room. The highlight of the day was definitely Alba Iulia, which is a beautiful city, I hope to return one day. Day 3 took me from Lipova to Szeged in Hungary, still following the river Mureș, although I didn't really see much of it until I crossed it at Mako. The Mureș joins the river Tisa at Szeged, which then flows onto the Danube. I remember it being very hot. I think my Garmin recorded 36 degrees at one point. Plus, it was pan flat and utterly boring riding across the Hungarian plains past fields of maize all day. In Szeged, I was hosted by a Be Welcome host, Peter, which is a bit like warm showers. We went to a local restaurant and it was great to have a chat and a couple of beers. Day 4 was more Hungarian plain, but I forsook my planned route and decided to ride straight up the Route 5 towards Budapest, again assuming that the vast majority of traffic would be on the motorway, which it was, most of the way. As I got closer to Budapest, though, this changed quite dramatically, and on occasions I found myself on really busy roads that I undoubtedly shouldn't have been on as a cyclist. At one point I got passed on both sides by lorries, which scared the bejesus out of me. Shortly after that, I pulled over to the side of the road to reevaluate my route and took to the side roads. The only problem was that some of the side roads were sandy, and that's where I had my only fall of the trip, but no damage done. Just after I turned off the main road, I found a stray dog. Unfortunately, there wasn't much I could do, but I sat and shared my biscuits and water with him for a while. It was getting pretty late as I rode into Budapest, and as I hadn't arranged anywhere to stay, or rather, none of my Be Welcome hosts had replied, but I knew the EV6 ran alongside the Danube past a hotel that I'd previously stayed in. So in my mind, I thought, I'll just stay there. I eventually picked up the signs for Eurovelo 6. It seemed to take forever for me to arrive at the hotel, and I thought I might have passed it. Eventually, I arrived and wheeled my dusty bike into the reception. I don't think I made a good initial impression, but when I mentioned what I was doing, that I'd stayed there before, they were very welcoming and gave me a good discount, free breakfast, and a room overlooking the Hungarian Parliament building, although the latter was wasted on me as I was asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. I spent the next 5 days riding up the Eurovelo 6 from Budapest to Regensburg, which were mostly uneventful. That's not to say nothing happened, but the route is so well developed, especially in Austria and Germany, that it's hard to fault. I started to camp here too because the cost of some of the hotels was much more expensive than in Romania. It wasn't so easy finding somewhere to eat either, as it was late September and a lot of the cafes were closed. I had to buy supplies in supermarkets as and when I could. Some sections of the Danube are stunning though. The section between Linz and Passau springs to mind, and I passed a number of cyclists coming in the opposite direction who'd taken the cycling option from the river cruise. At Regensburg, I spent a night with a couple of Be Welcome hosts who were quite amused when I had an impromptu interview from BBC Hereford and Worcester while sitting on their sofa. Interview done, we walked into town and had a meal together before they went on to an open mic night, and I went back to their apartment to sleep. Regensburg is where I left the Eurovelo 6 because it heads southwest at this point, whereas I wanted to cut across to the Eurovelo 15, where I planned to join it at Mainz. The next 2 days were a bit of a shock to the system after the shallow terrain of the Mureș Valley and Danube, but I still clocked up 112 miles and stopped for the night in Rothenburg, which is a beautiful place. I stayed the night above a Chinese restaurant, which was at least cheap. It did involve carrying my bicycle up 2 flights of stairs though, as there was nowhere to store it. As I headed out to look for dinner, I met a lady hauling her bike up the stairs too. We discussed the cycle storage situation, and she inquired as to whether I'd requested permission. I hadn't, and neither had she, so we left it at that. I headed out to look for dinner, but everywhere was booked up, so I ended up back at the Chinese restaurant, which wasn't. Draw your own conclusions from that. I ended up dining with the German lady I'd met on the stairs, and we compared plans. Turns out that she'd written from Darmstadt, my destination, for the following day. Regensburg to Darmstadt was also a bit of a challenge. I'd neglected to tick avoid off-road on my route planner. So after the third set of bumpy trails, I reverted to Google on my phone instead. This worked out okay, as I ended up riding a fair distance beside the River Main, which, despite it being late September, was still packed with tourists. The killer was the last hill from the main valley to the Rhine Valley. I could have continued along the Main through Frankfurt, but I had planned to meet an old colleague in Darmstadt, which unfortunately never happened. I did have an impromptu guide for the ride, though, to Darmstadt, as a young German cyclist saw me loaded up and offered to show me a better route to town. I was glad I took him up on his offer, as he led me through some of the parts that the RAF hadn't bombed during the war. The following day I set off towards Mainz, or at least I thought I did. My route didn't start until Mainz, but my Garmin helpfully offered to navigate to the start of route. What could possibly go wrong? 2 hours later, I arrived in Worms, 25 miles to the southwest of Darmstadt, instead of Mainz, 25 miles northwest of Darmstadt. This annoying detour added another 30 miles to my day and set my schedule back somewhat. I drowned my sorries in the central square before setting off north along the Rhine. Again, the EV15 is so well developed that it had no surprises in store for me. I enjoyed the Rhine Gorge UNESCO World Heritage Site through to Koblenz. From Bonn and beyond, the EV15 becomes, well, dare I say it, a bit boring. I passed quickly through Cologne, where I had also been earlier during the summer, and was heading for Dusseldorf when the heavens opened. I'd been pretty lucky with the weather, with rain leaving Lipova, but nothing since. I hid under a bridge next to the huge Bayer chemical factory, donned my waterproofs and continued. But the rain got heavier and heavier, so I decided enough was enough and booked myself into a hotel in a place called Dormagen, south of Dusseldorf. The following morning was a lot brighter, and I set off bright and early, hoping to reach Arnhem, which would then leave a day's ride to the ferry at Hook of Holland. The ferry didn't sail until something like 10 p.m, so I couldn't see anything stopping me from making it. I booked the ferry for the following day. From Dormagen, I rode through to Dusseldorf and then to Duisburg. As I sat in a cafe in Duisburg, I noticed the bridge on my route seemed to be closed. I headed towards it anyway, as we all know that closed doesn't necessarily mean closed to cyclists. Unfortunately, when I arrived on this occasion, closed definitely meant closed, which meant a bit of a detour. The rest of the day continued in the same vein, with closed bridges and even the EV15 closed for repair in several places. Eventually, I abandoned my Garmin completely and just relied on Google and dead reckoning to head in the right direction. Germany seemed to go on forever. I assumed that Xanten was in the Netherlands, which it isn't. It is the only town in Germany that begins with the letter X, though. I finally crossed the Rhine again at Emmerich, because the EV15 was closed on the south side of the river, and crossed the border into the Netherlands not long afterwards. I stopped just outside Arnhem to look for a hotel, but there was absolutely nothing available, or at least nothing at a price that I was willing to pay. There was a hotel in a place called Wageningen, about 10 miles further on though, so that's where I ended up, after 116 miles ridden. The hotel restaurant was closed, as there was a wedding reception in progress, so I ordered a pizza and ate in my room before hitting the sack. The next day was supposed to be my final day, and everything seemed to be going to plan, apart from a pretty stiff headwind. The roads were brilliant, of course they were, riding across the dikes and along dedicated cycle paths, but about lunchtime something started to feel not quite right. I felt absolutely drained of all energy, and I could tell something was seriously wrong when I was overtaken by a young lady on rollerblades. As I approached Rotterdam, I suddenly felt the urge to go to the bathroom, and as luck would have it, I wasn't far from a McDonald's. You can say what you like about McDonald's, but they always have a functional bathroom. I made it to the bathroom and let's just say, I had an upset tummy. I stayed in McDonald's a while and had a large drink and an ice cream, but it didn't help. I wasn't going to make it any further. I pulled up booking.com and booked a room in the closest hotel I could find, only a mile or so from Mackey's, and made my way there very slowly. At the check-in, I asked the lady where I could store my bike, and she said there was a meeting room which I could use. She went to the door and helpfully held it open for me, but I couldn't make it. I ducked into the gents in the reception and was violently sick in one of the cubicles. Once I'd stopped vomiting, I went outside and apologised. I finished storing my bike, headed for my room, and was sick again. I'm guessing I'd picked up some kind of food poisoning, or more likely norovirus in Wageningen. I spent the rest of the afternoon and evening being very ill. At some point in the evening, there was a knock at the door, and the lady from reception was outside. Apparently my wife, Jill, had called the hotel and asked if they could check up on me. I'd got into the habit of making a short movie every morning and every evening for social media, as quite a few people were following my progress. I'd also taken Stella's dog tracker with me, and with the lack of progress report, my wife had used the tracker to locate where I was and called the hotel. I assured the lady that I was okay, and no, I didn't think I needed a doctor, but she did offer to bring me a drink. I spent the rest of the night sipping water and Coca-Cola until gradually I managed to keep some of it down. The following morning I felt a lot better, but oh, so weak. Somehow I'd managed to put my ferry back 24 hours and now only had 25 miles to ride, but I think that was the slowest I've ever cycled 25 miles. It took me something like 3 hours. I had been offered breakfast at the hotel, but I just couldn't face anything. I arrived at Hook around 3 p.m, sat on a bench overlooking the ferry terminal, lay down and went to sleep. I must have looked like some kind of vagrant. I woke some time later feeling sunburnt and wandered into Hook for a drink, but I still couldn't face food. When the ferry started boarding a few hours later, I went straight to my cabin and went to bed. I think it was about 5 a.m. I was woken by "Don't Worry, Be Happy" being played over the loudspeaker, and an announcement that breakfast was being served. I still couldn't manage breakfast, but I had a shower, got dressed and slowly ate a banana. I rolled down the ramp to Harwich, aiming to get to an Airbnb I'd booked in Leighton Buzzard, about 120 miles away. On any other day, that would have been eminently doable, but not having eaten anything significant for approaching 48 hours, I suppose it was a bit of a tall order. I'd already explained to everybody in a video what had happened, and at one point Anne was threatening to send her husband in the happy bus to come and get me. I envisaged being bundled into a van in some kind of strange kidnapping scenario. I struggled on, and it was okay on the flat, but every time I came to a hill I almost ground to a halt. I think I was near Welling, and I remember it was getting dark, and Jill called me to ask what my plans were. I said, "I'm going to Leighton Buzzard," which was still 25 miles away at that point, probably about 3 hours at the pace I was going. Not long after, Anne called me and said, "I think you should stop," to which I apparently replied that I was okay and I was going to Leighton Buzzard. Jill called me as I was riding through Harpenden, and I finally conceded that I wasn't going to make Leighton Buzzard and I would look for somewhere closer. In the event, I ended up staying in a hotel at Luton Airport after riding 101 miles on a banana and some Lucozade. After a good night's sleep, I felt good enough to attempt some breakfast, which stayed down. Only had something like 90 miles remaining. I was still pretty slow, but as long as I kept turning the pedals, I was pretty sure I'd make it. I at least made it to Leighton Buzzard. I actually stopped in Winslow, not Arizona, and had coffee and cake, so things were looking up. As the day progressed, I started to recognise more familiar names, and once I'd reached Stratford-on-Avon, I knew I was nearly home. I think I rolled up outside the kennels about 5 p.m. to a waiting reception committee. I don't think I've ever been so glad to finish a bike ride. We raised about £7,500 during the ride itself, which I was more than happy with. In the event, I covered 1,700 miles in 18 days, which works out about 95 miles a day. So apart from food poisoning, everything went pretty much to plan. After a bit of a rest, I decided to turn the notes from my blog into a book, which I self-published with the intention of donating all the proceeds to Amici Dog Rescue. It's called Going to the Dogs, a bike ride across Europe, and it's available on Amazon. I don't think it's going to solve all of Amici's funding problems, but it can't hurt. The only remaining question now is, what next? Well, in 3 weeks' time, I shall be setting off for Tarifa, where I aim to cycle back to the kennels once more. Thanks for listening, and thanks to Andrew for his wonderful platform.
And thank you to you, Steve, for your kind words and also for taking the time to record that monologue. And again, my apologies for the delay in actually getting it into the podcast, but it was well worth a listen now that it's there. If you'd like to support Steve with his efforts with Amici Dog Rescue, you can go online and visit the website amicidogrescue.org.uk, and that's Amici, AMICII, Dog Rescue. And you can also get hold of a copy of his book, as he mentioned a few moments ago. So thank you, Steve, for all of that. Thank you also to Joel for his earlier contribution about his travels around Cyprus. And that is it for episode 87 of the Cycling Europe podcast. If you'd like to get in contact, you can do so by visiting cyclingeurope.org/contact. If you'd like to support the podcast, then you can do that by visiting cyclingeurope.org/support. So we're now at the very end of 2024. Don't know what's in store for 2025, but no doubt more episodes of the podcast, hopefully some travels on two wheels as well. So I hope you've all had a very good Christmas and best wishes for 2025 when it arrives. Or if it has arrived by the time you're listening to this, then I hope you had a good New Year. So Happy New Year to everybody, happy cycling, and I'll be back with episode 88 of the Cycling Europe podcast, hopefully very soon.